So now that we know the structure and function, or many functions, of the psoas muscle, it's important to find out what impacts the function. Why would we stretch the psoas, or why would we activate the psoas? And if we would do it, how best would we address the situation? So, what impacts psoas function? Well, use, and on the other side of the coin, disuse, the position of the femoral head in the acetabulum, all of the muscles of Thomas Myers' deep front line, and also, and this is a little bit more questionable than the others, the mechanics of the foot and ankle. So let's evaluate the arguments. Under use. So Shirley Sarman has been quoted as saying, in the event of an injury, look for a weak or underactive synergist. This idea has been taken by many people in the fitness industry who have realized that, well, the rectus femoris or the TFL, the hip flexors that work a lot better below 90 degrees to be dominant in movement. And so the psoas becomes underused. So they say, well, the rectus femoris is pulled in a sprint. It must be because the psoas isn't helping out enough. This argument seems to be relatively reasonable, as the psoas is a muscle that only works, or excuse me, is the only muscle that is active above 90 degrees of hip flexion. So that's the logic for activating an underused psoas. What's interesting and also kind of misunderstood in the industry is people say, well, you know, you told me in your glute article to stretch my psoas to facilitate glute function. And absolutely they did. They said, well, why would we activate a muscle that you also want to stretch? Aren't they two conflicting ideas? And while they're two conflicting ideas, I think people fail to see that the psoas can be locked short, yet it can be inactive. So the psoas, being a hip flexor, can shorten up because we spend so much time in a flexed hip position that it shortens, but it's not getting any activity, so it becomes short and weak, which is the rationale for activating a psoas and also stretching the psoas. This underuse can lead to big changes in tissue quality, that end plate dysfunction that leads to trigger point activity. Psoas trigger points can send pain down into the groin, into the back. So, in the event of an underused psoas, it demands for both stretching and activation. Overuse also contributes to the evolution of trigger points and other myofascial dysfunction. As noted here, it also can inhibit the glutes by reciprocal inhibition. Obviously, everyone here watching this hopefully realizes that if a muscle on one side is overactive, it inhibits the function of the muscle on the back side of the joint. Overuse or overactivity is not terribly common in my experience, but I work mostly with distance runners. You can see pretty frequently in athletes who sprint, who reach maximum velocity, and they are getting that high level of hip flexion. Treating this demands aggressive soft tissue therapy and also lengthening of the tissue. Activation probably is counterproductive in this sense. Another thing that the fitness industry and fitness professionals fail to address is the position of the femoral head. It's probably with good reason, because it's not exactly the most easy thing to assess for, nor is it to treat without manual methods. So the psoas inserts on the lesser trochanter, as we all now know, and has the ability to actually pull up the femur, and particularly the femoral head, into the acetabulum to that superior portion of the joint. Also, if it is somewhat biased towards external rotation, a short psoas is also going to force the femoral head anteriorly in the joint capsule. So now you're on that superior anterior portion, which happens to be the place that is also most common for labral tears of the hip. You can also correlate with a short psoas in this anterior migration of the femoral head what Diane Lee calls butt gripping, which is more or less hyperactivity of the deep rotators of the hip that again force the femoral head further forward into the joint capsule. It also restricts the posterior joint capsule and can lead to the posterior joint capsule being something that limits flexion. So it doesn't necessarily inhibit the psoas so much as it just limits joint movement around that. So this anterior and superior pull of the femoral head interferes with what's called centration of the joint. Joint centration is the position of the femoral head in the joint capsule that allows for optimal distribution of load. Furthermore, influencing the psoas function can be any muscle of the deep front line. So you can see on the right, the deep front line starts all the way at the tibialis posterior and works all the way up through the scalene muscles of the neck. Too much tone in any of these muscles can lead to too much tone in the psoas. Likewise, too little tone somewhere can create too much or too little tone elsewhere along the deep front line. A few key implications is there's a big impact on spinal stabilization. If we go back to the slide here, you can see that the psoas is also in the same fascial train as the diaphragm. Now, most people will recognize the psoas and diaphragm as two of the four components of, 4 or 5, depending on who you talk to, of the inner unit of the core. That is that anticipatory, more or less, what fires to create a stable base for more movement to occur. Transverse abdominis multifidus, as well as psoas, diaphragm, and pelvic floor. Also, there are postural implications. Too much psoas tone can lead to a forward head posture due to increasing tone at the scalenes. That tone could come from not necessarily a tight psoas, but maybe it's from the diaphragm. Maybe it's from even the posterior tibialis. Also, there seems to be a tug of war between Myers' deep front line and what he calls the lateral line. As the lateral line contains the peroneals, which are everters of the foot, and the deep front line contains